There was a time when a fistful of nutmeg could buy you a house, and Europeans slaughtered entire populations to control it. The tree grew almost nowhere but 10 tiny volcanic islands in eastern Indonesia. The Bandas, barely 45 square miles total. By 1600, a cargo of nutmeg bought in the Bandas could sell in Europe for a 32,000% markup. In 1621, the Dutch would kill or enslave almost all 15,000 Bandanese to seize it. But how did a seed become worth more than human life? The answer begins not with gold, but with fear. In the plague-haunted cities of Europe, nutmeg was not a flavor. It was medicine, magic, and rumored salvation. The spice came from a single tree, Myristica fragrans, which grew wild on the Banda Islands and almost nowhere else on Earth. From that obscure origin, a small brown seed traveled halfway around the world wrapped in mystique. That mystique was deadly serious to those who paid for it. Elizabethan doctors swore that a nutmeg pomander worn close to the body could ward off the plague. The College of Physicians in London recommended it against the outbreaks that struck the city again and again, including the epidemic of 1603 that killed roughly 30,000 Londoners, nearly a fifth of the population. When death walked the streets and no one understood contagion, a fragrant seed felt like armor. And belief, in a time of terror, sets prices no ledger can justify. So the prices climbed to something absurd. In 17th century London, nutmeg sold for enormous premiums by weight, treated less like a kitchen ingredient and more like a small fortune you could hold in your palm. A single pound could fetch the equivalent of a laborer's wages for months, and one contemporary account priced 10 pounds of nutmeg, bought for less than a penny in the Bandas, at nearly 2 pounds back in England. A return that made even wool merchants and goldsmiths blink. Men carried nutmeg the way others carried jewels, and that value radiated from one impossible fact almost no European yet understood. The impossible fact was geography. For centuries, no European knew where nutmeg actually grew. The seed arrived in Venice and Lisbon through a long chain of hands, and each hand kept the secret of the one before it. The source stayed hidden behind a wall of silence stretched across oceans. That silence was deliberate. Arab and Malay traders who moved the spice westward concealed its origin from Europeans, feeding them legends instead of coordinates. Some told buyers that nutmeg grew in the nets of fishermen off the coast of India. Others claimed it fell from the Garden of Eden. The spice passed through the ports of Malacca, then Calicut, then the Red Sea to Alexandria, where Venetian galleys collected it, each leg adding cost and confusion. As long as buyers did not know where nutmeg came from, the sellers held all the power. The mystery itself was a product, guarded as jealously as the seed. And the place they were hiding was almost laughably small. The Banda Islands total roughly 45 square miles, a scatter of volcanic peaks in the Maluku archipelago, the region Europe would call the Spice Islands. The largest, Banda Massacre, is only about 7 miles long, and the whole group is dominated by Gunung Api, an active volcano rising some 640 meters straight out of the sea. This handful of islands was the world's only source of nutmeg until the 1800s. Every seed on every European table began there. A secret that valuable could not stay hidden forever. The first Europeans to crack it flew the flag of Portugal, sailing east in the great age of ocean discovery, hunting for the origin of the spices that had made Venice rich. They followed the trade back along its own veins, port by port, until the trail led them to the Bandas. They arrived around 1512. A Portuguese expedition led by Antonio de Abreu reached the Banda Islands, the first Europeans known to lay eyes on the source. Abreu had sailed from the newly conquered port of Malacca with 3 vessels, guided by local pilots, and one of his captains, Francisco Serrao, was shipwrecked and stranded in the region for years afterward. Centuries of concealment collapsed in a single voyage. And yet solving the mystery turned out to be far easier than holding it, because the Portuguese could find the bandas, but they could not command them. They failed to build a permanent fort on Banda, unable to plant themselves firmly on those remote and defiant shores. They traded, they came and went, but never turned discovery into domination. That failure left a door standing open, and through it would come a colder, more systematic power. That power was Dutch, and it did not come to trade. In 1602, the Dutch established the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, something new in the world. The company was capitalized at more than 6.4 million guilders, an enormous sum raised from ordinary Amsterdam citizens as well as merchants, making it arguably the first joint stock company whose shares traded publicly. It was a corporation built for conquest, and it looked at the nutmeg trade and saw not a market to join but a monopoly to seize. The VOC was armed like a nation. It was granted powers to wage war, sign treaties, and build forts. A private company with the sovereignty of a state. Its charter, issued by the States General of the Dutch Republic, gave it a monopoly on all Dutch trade east of the Cape of Good Hope for an initial 21 years, and the right to mint coins and appoint governors in the lands it took. No European enterprise had ever carried such authority so far from home, and it aimed all of it at one goal in the bandas: total control of the nutmeg at its source. That goal shaped every demand they made. They demanded exclusive purchase rights from the Bandanese leaders, insisting that all nutmeg be sold to them alone at their price forever. To the company, a signed contract meant an owned island. To the Bandanese, that idea would prove not just foreign, but incomprehensible. And there lay the fracture that would break into blood. The Bandanese signed contracts they did not consider binding, treating them as gestures of friendship rather than eternal chains around their economy. Their society had no single ruler to sign for all. Power was held by the Orang Kaya, the rich men, who headed each village and made decisions collectively. They had traded freely for generations with anyone who came. They sold to the Dutch and then sold to others too. To the VOC, that was betrayal. To the Bandanese, it was simply commerce. The Dutch answered perceived betrayal with force, and the Bandanese answered force with ambush. In 1609, Dutch Admiral Pieter Verhoef came to press the contracts and build a fort, summoning the local leaders to negotiate. He arrived with a fleet of 13 ships and began construction of a stone stronghold, Fort Nassau, on the site of an old Portuguese ruin, ignoring Bandanese protests. It was a trap sprung in reverse. The Bandanese struck first, killing Verhoef along with about 40 of his men in a sudden, bloody attack. That massacre hardened everything. The Dutch now saw the Bandanese not as trading partners who broke faith, but as enemies who spilled Dutch blood, and the memory of Verhoef's death would be invoked to justify horrors to come. A young clerk named Jan Pieterszoon Coen was present in the region during these years and absorbed the lesson that the Bandanese could not be trusted. Reprisals followed, and the mood soured into something murderous. But before the final storm broke, one rival power slipped in to complicate the Dutch design. That rival was England. English merchants, chasing the same profits, secured a foothold the Dutch could not simply erase. By 1616, the English had planted themselves on Run, one of the smallest Banda Islands, and on a nearby speck called AI, striking their own deals with local growers and flying their own flag over nutmeg groves the VOC considered its birthright. Run became a splinter the Dutch could not pull out. The English defense there was led by a stubborn captain named Nathaniel Courthope, who arrived with a handful of ships and a refusal to leave. He arrived in December 1616 aboard the Swan with a second vessel, the Defense, and formally accepted the island's submission to King James I, the islanders signing a document that made Run, in English eyes, a possession of the crown. He made a pact with the islanders, who preferred distant English partners to the Dutch, who wanted to own them outright. And then he simply held on. He held on with almost nothing. Courthope defended Run for nearly 4 years against Dutch pressure, blockade, and threat, clinging to a scrap of land barely more than a coral outcrop with a spring. His garrison was tiny, his supplies thin, his position hopeless by any sober reckoning. His 2 ships were seized by the Dutch early on, and he was left with fewer than 40 men, yet he refused repeated offers and threats. In October 1620, he was finally ambushed and shot dead crossing the water at night, his body lost to the sea. But he understood what Run represented. As long as an English flag flew there, the Dutch monopoly had a crack in it. That crack drove the company to install a man who intended to seal it in blood. In 1618, Jan Pieterszoon Coen became Governor-General of the VOC. Coen was brilliant, tireless, and utterly without mercy. He looked at the messy, half-controlled bandas and saw a problem with only one solution. His philosophy was chillingly simple. Coen believed trade could not exist without conquest, that commerce and violence were the same tool held at different angles. "We cannot make war without trade, nor trade without war," he wrote to his directors in Amsterdam, a line that became infamous. Willing sellers, in his mind, were unreliable. Owned subjects were not. He did not want to bargain with the Bandanese. He wanted them gone, replaced by a population that would grow nutmeg on Dutch terms and nothing else. To make that vision real, he built an army. Coen assembled a fleet and hired mercenaries for a campaign against Banda, gathering ships, soldiers, and hardened killers from across the company's reach. He mustered a force of roughly 2,000 men, including about 1,600 Dutch soldiers and sailors, alongside hundreds of Japanese and Indonesian auxiliaries, carried on nearly 20 ships. This was not a trading mission with soldiers attached. It was an invasion force with a spreadsheet targeting the total elimination of Bandanese independence. In 1621, he unleashed it. Coen's assault on Banda began that year, his fleet descending with overwhelming force. The pre-invasion Bandanese population was roughly 15,000 people, spread across villages, harbors, and terraced groves that had grown nutmeg for 1,000 years. Within months, that world was systematically torn apart. The violence was deliberate and organized, the machinery of extermination. Coen hired Japanese mercenaries, skilled swordsmen, to execute the Bandanese leaders. The men who might have organized resistance were seized, and the killing was designed to break the people's will along with their bodies. It was closer to annihilation. The numbers tell the horror plainly. Around 40 to 45 village elders, the Orang Kaya, who governed and negotiated for their communities, were beheaded and quartered, their bodies displayed as a warning. With their leaders butchered, the population had no center left to defend. Thousands more were deported as slaves or starved during the siege, hunted through the hills, crowded onto ships bound for distant plantations. When the smoke cleared, a people had nearly ceased to exist. Roughly 1,000 Bandanese survived on the islands after 1621, out of the 15,000 who had lived there when Coen arrived. The rest were dead, enslaved, or scattered. An entire society, with its own language, its own leaders, its own 1,000-year relationship with a single tree, had been erased in months to protect a price. But the islands still had to produce, and dead people grow no nutmeg. The Dutch had emptied the land they had killed for. Their answer was as cold as the massacre that created the need. If the original growers were gone, they would import new ones and own them completely. They carved the conquered ground into estates. The VOC divided Banda into plantations called perken, neat parcels of nutmeg groves handed to Dutch settlers and company favorites. The islands were surveyed into roughly 68 such parcels, each a fixed number of nutmeg trees to be tended and delivered to the company at prices the VOC alone fixed. These were the spoils of genocide, distributed like property. The land had been cleared of its people to be reassigned by paperwork. The men who ran those estates had a name and a system. They were the Perkeneers, and they operated their plantations using enslaved workers. Enslaved people were imported from across the region, from Java, from other parts of the Indonesian archipelago, and later from as far as the coasts of Africa and India. To replace the exterminated Bandanese, forced to tend the very trees whose true owners had been slaughtered. Mortality among them was brutal, and the Perkeneers had to keep importing fresh laborers just to keep the groves worked. Every seed was soaked in that history. With production secured through slavery, the company turned to defending its prize against the rest of the world. A monopoly is only as strong as its edges, and nutmeg trees, unlike gold, could sprout anywhere a seed happened to fall. So the VOC set out to make sure they fell nowhere the company did not control. They waged war on the tree itself. They did it methodically, year after year. The VOC conducted annual extirpation voyages, sailing to islands beyond their grip to hunt down and destroy any nutmeg tree growing outside sanctioned ground. These patrols, known as hongi expeditions, used fleets of local war canoes crewed by conscripted islanders, sweeping through the Maluku Islands to burn groves and enforce the company's decrees at spear point. Under company policy, nutmeg was confined to Banda and cloves to Ambon, and everywhere else the spice was to be uprooted and burned. The Dutch deliberately shrank the natural world to fit their ledger, and they guarded the living seed as if it were a state secret. Smuggling nutmeg seedlings out of the islands was punishable by death, and there were stories of seeds dipped in lime to kill their power before they left Dutch hands. The company understood the true source of its wealth was not the nutmeg already grown, but the possibility of growing more. Kill that possibility everywhere else, and the monopoly could last forever. That was the theory. The rivalry with England, meanwhile, ended in one of the strangest bargains in the history of empire. Courthope was long dead, and the English claim to run had faded into a legal ghost. In 1667, the two nations sat down to end their overlapping quarrels, including the old grievance over that tiny Banda island. The deal they struck sounds invented. Under the Treaty of Breda, the English formally ceded Run Island to the Dutch, surrendering the last foreign foothold in the Bandas and handing the VOC its perfect, unbroken monopoly at last. In exchange, the Dutch confirmed English control of a colony on the far side of the world called New Amsterdam. We know it today as Manhattan. Read that again and let it land. The English traded a place that would become the beating heart of New York City for a nutmeg island smaller than many airports. At the time, it looked like a fair swap, perhaps even a Dutch victory, because nutmeg was worth more than almost anything, and Manhattan was a muddy trading post. Value, it turns out, is a story people agree to tell, and that story was about to change forever. The change came through a single determined thief. For all the executions and burnings, a living nutmeg seed is a small, portable thing, and the world is wide. In the 1770s, a French administrator and botanist named Pierre Poivre smuggled nutmeg plants out of the region and carried them to the French island of Mauritius, breaking the wall the Dutch had killed to build. Once the tree escaped, there was no calling it back. From Mauritius, the plant spread, and the British later transplanted nutmeg to their own tropical colonies, most fatefully to the Caribbean island of Grenada and to Penang in the east. The seed the Dutch had tried to chain to one archipelago now grew on the other side of the planet. Grenada took to it so completely that it became known as the Isle of Spice. And with that, the entire logic of the Banda Massacre came undone. Nutmeg prices fell sharply once cultivation spread across the globe, because what had made the spice priceless was never the flavor. It was the scarcity, the single source, the wall around one small place. Break the monopoly, and the magic evaporates. The seed that had bought houses became a seed that grew in many gardens. The company that had built its empire on that scarcity did not outlive it by much. The VOC was dissolved in 1799, bankrupt and corrupt, its monopoly shattered. The greatest corporation the world had yet seen, armed with the power to wage war, collapsed once the tree it had murdered thousands to control could be grown anywhere warm and wet. Today, Grenada produces a large share of the world's nutmeg, thousands of miles from the islands where the story began. And the Bandas were left holding the ruins. The islands that had been the center of a global obsession slid into poverty and obscurity once their monopoly meant nothing, half forgotten by the world that had once killed to reach them. The forts, the graves, the emptied villages remained, but the wealth moved on, chasing the seed to cheaper shores. Which brings us to the small brown jar in your kitchen. Nutmeg today costs a few dollars per jar, sitting on a supermarket shelf between the cinnamon and the cloves, utterly ordinary. You grate it into eggnog or a pie and think nothing of it. It has no mystique left, no power, no fear attached. It is just a spice. But that ordinariness hides a grave. An estimated 90% of the Bandanese were killed or displaced in 1621, an entire people nearly wiped from the earth so that a company could set a price. On the islands today, Banda's ruined Dutch forts still stand among the nutmeg groves, stone teeth in the green, watching over the trees that outlived the people who first tended them. The seed remembers nothing. The stone remembers everything. So the next time a little dust of nutmeg drifts into your food, understand what you are holding. A seed worth more than lives. For a few centuries, human beings decided that a flavor justified extermination, and then the world simply moved on and forgot. The nutmeg in your cabinet is cheap now, but the price it once carried was paid by 15,000 people whose names we never learned. If this story stayed with you, consider subscribing so more forgotten histories like it can find their way back into the light.